Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Compton, and welcome to this afternoon's session on new approaches to curation and research. I am a member of the Art UK Advisory Board, and I write about 19th and 20th century sculpture. Before we get into the meat of this afternoon's session, I have to run through a few housekeeping matters. First of all, although the chat function is enabled, please put your questions for speakers into the Q&A function, which is a button at the bottom of the screen. This is important because questions entered into the chat may get overlooked. I will be putting a selection of your questions to the speakers at the end of the session. Next, there are closed captions available. Thanks to My Clear Text through Stage Text. To enable the live captions, you need to click on the CC closed caption button, also at the bottom of the screen, and a transcript will be available at the end of the conference on request. Finally, the session is being recorded and the video will be made available on Art UK's YouTube channel in due course. I was keen to chair this session on curation and research because it has been so interesting as a member of the board to see how the records and images created by Art UK have been opening up new conversations about sculpture and are also making it possible for us to see a whole range of new connections between works in UK's museums and galleries. Today's papers, three papers, offer a sample of these new dialogues. They also happen to be topical to Women's History Month as they look at the work of women sculptors, the changing professional status of women, and also representations of the female form. We open with Louise Weller's talk on Cathie Pilkington and her recent project at Pallant House Gallery. That's followed by Rosamund Lily West on pioneering women at the Royal Society of Sculptors. And we round off with Julia Carver's exploration of the sculpture of Reg Butler in relation to desire and agency. So first of all, I will introduce you to Louise Weller. Louise is head of exhibitions at Pallant House Gallery, where she's worked since 2015. And among the many shows she's curated are Pop, Art in a Changing Britain, that was 2018. Another one on dance, movement and modernism, also 2018. Jan Howarth, Close Up, 2019. And most recently, Cathie Pilkington, Working from Home, the subject of today's talk. So I'll now hand us over to Louise. Welcome.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. So as I say, I'm Louise Weller. I'm head of exhibitions at Pallant House Gallery in Chichester, and I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, one moment. Sorry. Right, just. Sorry about this. Sorry. I'll try again. Oh dear.
Hello, Louise. Are you
Yes,
trying to get the PowerPoint to show?
Yes, it's because I've got the toolbar above it.
If you go to the bottom, there's a little icon which will allow you to go straight in. It's the sort of one furthest to the right.
Is that it?
Yes, I think you've done it. Brilliant.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thought I had it all sorted. Anyway, sorry. So go back to Pallant House Galleries in Chichester. And I say I'm delighted to be talking today about Cathie Pilkington's recent exhibition installation, which was called Working from Home. It was at Pallant House Gallery for about 6 months between 2018 and 2019. So for those who may not know us, our home is an 18th century townhouse with a modern extension. And through our collection and exhibition programme, we focus on modern British art from about 1900 to now. So our founding collection was gifted to Chichester District Council by Walter Hussey, who had been Dean of the Chichester Cathedral. And through his support of the arts, he had developed a personal art collection that included the works of Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Graham Sutherland, and Paul Nash. And it was Hussey's belief that you could show modern art in an historic building. And so over a course of years, the 18th century townhouse was converted into a gallery, which was opened in the early 1980s. And we're soon to celebrate our 40th anniversary. And this dissolving of boundaries between the area of display and the work itself is something that's a central theme in Cathie Pilkington's exhibition, which we'll investigate further. And so really just to give you a brief introduction to Cathie, she's an artist who engages critically with the history of figurative sculpture, and she crosses borders of traditional, modern and contemporary expression. Her work combines intensely modelled and painted sculptures with immersive installations. Her site-responsive installations are balanced sort of ambivalently between chaos and precision, and that's something you'll see as we go through today's paper. She's been a member of the Royal Academy since 2014, and she was appointed the first female professor of sculptor at the Royal Academy Schools in 2016, where she's currently keeper. And so the project was titled Working from Home. And while this has a particular resonance to the current moment, the domestic has always been a strong theme running through her work. Cathie is intrigued by the idea that as a child, the home is your universe, and you create these strong emotional connections to the objects and spaces that surround you. And so following discussions with her, the project took the form of an immersive site-specific installation that extended across the top 4 galleries of the 18th century townhouse. Each of the 4 rooms were conceived both as a complete work in themselves and as part of the total installation. As this slide, you can see the upper landing where this sculpture called Twinkle stands, and she acts as both sort of a guardian and a guide into the exhibition. And Neil Walton, who wrote an essay on the exhibition, describes the scene as ascending the wide and well-lit wooden staircases of Pallant House Gallery's historic townhouse. You encounter the figure of a dreaming girl. This is Twinkle, one of Cathie Pilkington's characteristically doll-like sculptures. With her eyes closed, she seems self-absorbed, concentrating like a young clairvoyant, connecting to some invisible domain or unconscious fantasy. A psychopomp, a conductor of spirits, a border crosser, guiding us into the exhibition. Now, the realization of the exhibition at Pallant House Gallery can be seen as part of a series of projects that Cathie had been engaged with over a number of years that questioned the spaces in which female artists produce and display their work. And so in 2017, she worked on a project called Life Room, Anatomy of a Doll, in which she took over the life room at the Royal Academy Schools. Now, this is a room that is steeped in history and tradition, and quite a male-orientated history. And in this slide, you can see this collection of cast busts from which students would learn the skills of observation and anatomical drawing. And while the curved seats can trace their history back to William Hogarth's Academy on St. Martin's Lane in the 1730s, the history of this room is fascinating and it has changed over time. And for Cathie to engage with that history was central to her work. But it was an engagement that's also quite disruptive in that it introduces elements that confound and say disrupt the conventional understanding. And often she brings in these sort of gathering of sculptural dolls and surreal blankets that are hand painted, and often uses what she terms as low grade display prints, often made out of a material like pegboard. And these sculptures were called Degas dolls. And they were constructed from separate parts, sort of mixing together heads and limbs. She would often start with maybe a collection of heads and a collection of different limbs and sort of create them in plaster limbs that she would then manipulate and combine together before building a traditional sort of armature with which the wet clay would then support all these elements together. There was sort of a surreal coming together of found elements, found objects to create a whole. But it was sort of a time-consuming process, and Cathie has spoken of the technical difficulty of creating her work is something that is part of it, that slows down her thinking about what it is that she's doing, especially around the figurative form. She says, I have to feel my way through the form. It has to be believable, but strange enough to be interesting. I want the figure to have a kind of impossible anatomy. And then only when she is happy that with the clay form are they cast into bronze, and then often painted or adorned with materials and clothing as well. And so in the summer of 2018, Cathie occupied the studios, gallery and the domestic apartment of Doric House. Now, Doric House Museum is part of Kingston University. And it's at the centre that supports sort of women's creative practice, sort of in the spirit of Dora Gordine, who commissioned this striking 1936 house where she lived, but more importantly, created this amazing studio with which to work and to display her own work. And so Cathie was invited to undertake the inaugural residency, working in the studio and sort of inhabiting her space, taking on that working and living space, and really collaborating with the existing collection as well of sculpture, and sort of inserting her work into the spaces. And so this was sort of a move on from the Life Room, which is a purely sort of art space, into one that combines both the domestic and the studio. And so when Cathie was invited to work with us at Pallant House Gallery, it was both the gallery's collection of modern British art and the domestic scale and history of the galleries in the townhouse that caught her imagination. Unlike the previous two locations, these were not studio spaces or domestic spaces in which work had been produced, but rather it had been historically a building that its function had changed over time, since it was first built as one of the finest homes in Chichester in about 1712. But the scale of the galleries had retained their domestic origins. And so Cathie has stated that being able to approach such a rich collection of works in the intimacy of domestic architecture is one of the things that first drew her to Pallant House Gallery. And she writes, I am convinced that work made on an intimate scale, involving the viewer in close proximity, has as much power to deal with the big subjects as any macho museum scale art. And so because this is only a short paper, I will focus on just one of the rooms, although at the end I will share a few installations of the other 4 rooms. And so on her first visit, Cathie was enthralled by an 18th century George Hepplewhite 4-poster bed that used to be on display. And I apologise for the quality of the photograph. It was the only one I could access at the moment. But as you can see, it was a bit of a mix of styles with a sort of a satin peach canopy valance and drapes and an embroidered bedspread. And the historical dates of those elements didn't match. And as with much of Cathie's work, she seeks to sort of dissemble any sort of conventional understanding and to make visible the internal structures behind a traditional facade. And so this bed and all the associations that come with it caught her imagination. And so she both metaphorically deconstructed the idea of the bed as a complex space connected with the ideas of memory, of desire and display. But she also literally took it apart, turning it from a functional object of furniture into more of a framing device in which to display her doll-like sculptural objects. And so in this slide, we can see our art technicians working closely with Cathie, sort of slowly removing layer by layer the sort of extraneous elements. So the valances, the pillows, the mattress went. And finally, at one point during the installation, when we just weren't thinking it was quite right, we took the silk canopy off the roof. And so Cathie also hand painted and stitched lengths of fabric, which were then to sort of remade the bed. And in this way, it shifts within categories between a bedscape, a painting as well, and also a sculpture or even a stage. And the whole work was titled Good Bed, Bad Bed. And an outcome of the exhibition is that we were funded to secure the fact that Cathie could then, so these figures are made in plaster, and she was able to cast them into bronze, and the whole piece has now been acquired into the gallery's permanent collection, which is fantastic. And we hope to, in the future, represent it. And it's also interesting to think that it could be represented in other locations, and those histories would then inform the work. And so while Good Bed, Bad Bed was the focal point, it was also only one element in what was a multi-layered installation. And so in this room, Cathie also brought together works including, sort of on the left here, a piece called Curator 4, the stretcher, which actually forms part of Good Bed, Bad Bed. It was meant to be situated at the end of the bed, but through the installation process, we've moved it across to the fireplace. And also by the window, dummies in a landscape, which is all of these elements together. And it was interesting while assisting Cathie in the installation of this particular piece that so we spent a whole evening sort of folding blankets quite precisely together and layering them up, making those layers. And it was, we were in this sort of dreamlike room, and we were sort of fell into conversation about other things. And one of them was our childhood memories of constantly moving furniture around in our bedrooms. And this shift in conversation between art historical discourses to more personal memories underlines much of Cathie's work. And so through her work, she sort of challenges this idea of the single, defined, correct understanding or interpretation, which she terms quite a sort of patriarchal idea that a very unified sculpture sits on a plinth and knows exactly what it's about. And where she seeks to create art where there's value in sort of ambiguity, doubt and speculation. And Cathie relates this to a particular sort of feminine thinking, one that has historically had to negotiate around sort of inflexible structures to find a space in which to function and flourish. And also across the room, there are artwork. So she had access to the whole of our collection of paintings, drawings, prints, and works on paper. And the selection that she made really accentuates this notion of the domestic habitation and creates a real feeling of intimacy within the room. And for those who experienced the exhibition, there was also a slightly disquieting sense of trespass, that you were entering a space where you weren't quite meant to be, or there was something that was being revealed to you. And so in this slide, you can also see works by artists Nana Shiomi, Suzanne Valadon, and Edgar Degas, as well as being presented alongside works on paper by Cathie herself. And as the whole room was conceived as a total work of art, rather than a display of sort of individual works, we took the decision to not include individual labels, which sort of made the work a whole space and also allowed the viewer to sort of bring their own interpretations and memories and thoughts to the piece as well. Although we did provide a list of works for those visitors who wanted to have that information. And central, as I said, a central sort of working philosophy of Cathie's is the breaking down of these hierarchies. And this relates to ideas about sort of appropriateness or acceptability, material value, concealment, and display. And this crossing of boundaries was sort of playfully realized when she co-opted two cupboards in the room. One had been closed for years, and the other, while had been used to display a wall place piece, never sort of invited you in to enter. And so Cathie really opened up to these cupboards, sort of revealing and reveling in entering these sort of threshold spaces, and also highlighting the divide between the private and the public, storage and display, which is also a part of the sort of the life of a gallery as well. There's many works that aren't on display, that sort of are hidden away behind the scenes, and she's sort of playing with that that division that goes on around display and presentation. It was also in these cupboard spaces that sort of Cathie sort of crammed a lot of work into a small space, for she feels that all materials have a sort of a value and a connection to her work. They sort of have a residue that sort of finds its way back into a work, or a new work could be picked up by the next one. And she also sees this sort of as a tactic of flattening out, again, another sort of notion of hierarchy between the value of materials. And so in this slide, you can see a sort of a gathering of materials. So there's pegboards, lining paper, a fluorescent tape, which she, I always associate with her now, blankets, mixed fabrics, a drawing by Victor Willing from the collection, and also one of her Degas dolls. So reintroducing a work from a previous project and recycling it into another project.
Louise,
yes.
Hello, you've got a couple of 2 minutes now.
Oh, okay, yes, certainly. So so across all 4 rooms, so what I will do then is I will quickly share the So these are just the other 3 rooms then. So there's one that was called Strange Coast that dealt with sort of the British surrealism and the imaginative landscape in which to cite her figurative works. So that relates back to some earlier papers about sculpture in the landscape within the gallery. And then there was a room called Playing Dead, in which she looked at sort of the ideas around vulnerability and protection and played on this sort of a nurturing and ambivalent emotions associated with the mother and child relationship. And then in the last room, there was a room called Still Life, which again really sort of brought together all her thinking around how our relationship with objects that we surround ourselves with. And on the one side, she had this sort of oppressive living room space with ornamentation and mirrors and paintings. And on the other side of the room, she had a much more sort of studio space, a working space filled with found objects, half-finished works. And again, all her work, as I think you can see, is sort of this idea of a collage of works, almost like a structural painting, and often of differing and conflicting ideas and memories through which we construct our own sense of identity. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Louise. That was a wonderful paper, and Cathie Pilkington's work is extraordinary, and I look forward to us being able to talk some more about it at the end. So our second paper this afternoon is by Rosamund Lily-West, who is the Paul Mellon Research Curator at the Royal Society of Sculptors. And Rosamund is researching pioneering women at the heart of the Royal Society of Sculptors. And she's also a documentary curator at the London Transport Museum, and is writing up a PhD on the housing and public sculpture of post-war London County Council at Kingston University. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rosamund.
Thank you, Anne. I'll just share my screen. There, I hope everyone can see that. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's been a really great day. First of all, I shall introduce the Royal Society of Sculptors and the project Pioneering Women. Then I'll discuss the early days of the Society and the admittance of women, and what the archive reveals about the women featured in the project. And finally, just what the project outcomes have been. I hope you'll bear with me, as this is very much ongoing research and archival practice, not the presentation of finished outcomes, especially as the current COVID situation has made the archive inaccessible for some time. And I know that's something that we're all sharing at the moment. For those of you who have not heard of the Society, the Royal Society of Sculptors is an artist-led membership organisation established in 1905, and the aim was the promotion and advancement in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, its colonies and dependencies, of the art of sculpture and the maintenance and protection of the interests of sculptors and the elevation of the status of the profession of sculpture. It was really an offshoot of the Royal Academy. Sculptors felt that their interests were not adequately served by the Royal Academy, feeling that sculpture was distinct enough from two-dimensional art to warrant its own society. The first slide I showed the Society's headquarters, Dora House in South Kensington, and that's where the archive is housed currently. Containing over 1,000 member files, as well as council minutes dating from the first meeting in 1905 and annual reports dating from 1919, the archive is a unique and fascinating resource on sculpture in the 20th and 21st centuries. The project, Pioneering Women at the Heart of the Royal Society of Sculptors, began in 2019 and is funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art. The aim of the project was to use the uncatalogued archive of the Royal Society of Sculptors to research female sculptors who were practicing in the early to mid-20th century. I was presented with a list of 10 women initially that were written into the funding application, and then I identified a further 15. Locating women in the archive was a challenge, as the archive is completely uncatalogued. I began by physically looking through the membership files, looking for women's names, which bore little fruit. I then looked to the annual reports, as these have lists of members in the back: associate members, fellows, honorary members, retired members, and also deceased members. The women I have researched all have their gender and their profession in common, but they are quite a wide-ranging group of women. The oldest in the project, Lady Theodora Gleichen, was born in 1861, and the most recent women have only died in the last few years. There's a countess related to Queen Victoria, that's Gleichen, a Holocaust survivor, a librarian, and the odd OBE. The 25 women featured are Lady Theodora Gleichen, Dora Gordine, Christine Gregory, Rose Gwyneth Holt, Lady Kathleen Scott, Barbara Tribe, Josephina Hermes de Vasconcelos, Constance Ann Parker, Constance Friedman, Edith Elizabeth Jukes, Elizabeth Costa, Enid Mitchell, Erica Lee, Gertrude Alice Meredith Williams, Judith Black, Karen Johnson, Kathleen Parbury, Margaret Wrightson, Marion Willis Stanfield, Marjorie Drawbell, Naomi Blake, and Sheila Mary Mitchell. I had intended for as diverse a group as possible when I picked these women to focus on for the project. However, of the women I picked for this project from the Royal Society of Sculptors membership, there are no women of colour, there are no trans women, there is one LGBTQ+ woman, Julian Phelps Allen, originally known as Eva Dorothy Allen. She changed her name around 1929. I picked these women out of a very small pool using an uncatalogued archive. Even finding the women's names was a challenge. To be a professional female sculptor in the early to mid 20th century was very difficult. These 25 women on the whole come from a certain class and level of privilege, plus they had to get through the gatekeeping process of a royal society led and populated by men. Women of colour, disabled women and LGBTQ+ women suffered an extra layer of prejudice, which effectively excluded them from the Royal Society of Sculptors in those early years. For decades, the mechanisms of the society remained very male. The society referred to female sculptors as lady sculptors, and sculptors is assumed a man, issued forms with he as the only pronoun, and members referred to each other in meetings as brother sculptor. To be elected to the society, a woman would have had to have been recognised by her peers as a professional, someone making their living from sculpture, and with a body of work behind them. In the early days of the society, membership was certainly not about supporting emerging artists. Members, and certainly fellows, were established artists with established careers. Then, as now, a sculptor had to be recognised as a professional, although members often had another way of earning an income, commonly teaching. Once a certain amount of women were elected to the society after 1922, at first you only see women nominating other women on very rare occasions, probably due to their small numbers. For instance, none of the early women in the research project nominated any of the other women. They were all nominated by men. The Society of Sculptors, as it was then, first met on the 10th of January 1905. Present were Sir Thomas Brock, Sir George Frampton, Francis Derwent Wood, Sir Charles Laws Witterong, David McGill, Sir William Reynolds Stevens, and Franklin Jenkins. At the first meeting, the form of nomination and application for membership was read out, and there was a list of 28 sculptors who were asked to join the society as original members without the formality of proposal or seconding. The letter of invitation is pasted into the minute book and explains, and I quote, "In fulfilment of the trust imposed upon us by a meeting of sculptors to establish a society having for its object the protection of the interests of British sculptors and the consolidation in Great Britain of the profession of sculpture, we now have the pleasure to announce to you the conclusion of our task." At the second meeting on 10th of March 1905, it is asked whether a report should be given explaining the formation of the society, and the answer given, every sculptor of any standing would have been communicated with in one way or another. It was not necessary to issue such a report, and that no communication be therefore made. This demonstrates that upon its establishment, the society was not an open, transparent society. It was closed to all but a certain section of artistic society, most importantly men. Access to the society at this point relied upon a small group of men with similar backgrounds, education, and social circles, precisely the kind of network that women were on the whole excluded from, or at least found harder to access. In addition to this, sculpting was seen as a very masculine art form. Women were often seen as incapable of such creativity and physically too weak to practice sculpture. Barbara Hepworth famously often suffered from what she termed the little woman problem, because men would comment on how amazing it was that such a small woman could manipulate and carve such large pieces. Women also faced accusations of amateurism, as well as facing huge societal pressure to fulfill the role of wife and mother and to put their artistic practice aside. The quote, "Every sculptor of any standing," is interesting, as they do not mean women. The 7 men present at the first meeting, Sir Thomas Brock, Sir George Frampton, Francis Derwent-Wood, Sir Charles Laws Whitterong, David McGill, Sir William Reynolds Stevens and Franklin Jenkins, were indeed well-known sculptors and held positions of influence within the society in the early years. Brock was president between 1905 and 1908, then again in 1914 to 19. Frampton was president from 1911 to 1912. Laws Whitterong was president from 1909 to 1911, and Reynolds Stevens was president from 1921 to 33. The description of any sculptor of any standing reads like an old boys club, which it really was. So this project asked, where were the women? From the founding of the society in 1905, women becoming members was not encouraged, as they were not actually even eligible for membership. It is briefly discussed in the minutes and then rebuffed that they might be allowed as honorary members, which was the same status as non-British citizens. Remarkably, at the second ever council meeting on the 2nd March 1905, Sir Charles Laws Whitterong, founding member and president from 1909 to 11, recommended to the general meeting that ladies be eligible for membership. The idea of female members is raised on quite a few occasions over the years, but it is not until 1909 that women are allowed to become a member on the same footing as a man, coming into effect in 1910, notably under the presidency of Laws Whitterong, who first suggested female membership in 1905, and not Brock. Interestingly, the first women were not admitted until 1922, and they were Lady Theodora Gleichen, posthumously, Flora Kendrick, and Christine Gregory. To put that date, 1909, into context, the Society of Women's Artists predates this, as does the Women's Art Guild. However, as women-only organisations, they would not have had the same influence or perceived importance as a male organisation. It is not until 1936 that Dame Laura Knight was the first woman to be elected a full member of the Royal Academy, and so a woman could be elected on the same footing as a man into the Royal Society of Sculptors before they could at the Royal Academy. After these initial 3 women were elected in 1922, you can see from this slide that on the 5th of February 1923, Mr. Pomeroy suggested that members might approach some lady sculptors of outstanding ability in order to forward the interests of the society, and the names of Miss Windsor, Miss Steele and Miss Atchison were mentioned as desirable candidates. Sadly, I could never find in the archive evidence of what happened about Miss Steele and Miss Windsor. Presumably they were approached, but Anne Crawford Atchison became an associate member in 1923 and then went on to become the first woman to be elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Sculptors in 1938. The archive of the Royal Society of Sculptors, as I mentioned, contains over 1,000 membership files relating to individual sculptors. These membership files can contain photographs, slides, press cuttings, exhibition catalogues and correspondence. Sadly, many of these early women have no membership file or had no membership file. Anne Atchison, who I just mentioned, despite her success and importance to the society, only had about 3 pieces of paper in her member file, which related to a recent BBC filming inquiry. I think we can agree that women's role in art and their profession as artist, in this case sculptor, is often sidelined, erasing them from the art historical canon. But in this case, the Society's institutional history also plays a part. Many of our male members, even some presidents, have no membership file. The archive originated through the Society encouraging members to deposit material for the Society's archive. Members would be asked to submit slides and photographs of work for the purposes of awards, publications and external inquiries from bodies such as the Royal Institute of British Architects. There was a very fluid retention of this material over the years due to there being no professional archivist on board, and also because the Society floated between different premises before coming to our current and only headquarters, Dora House, bequeathed to the Society by sculptor Cecil Thomas upon his death in 1976. At points in the Society's history, members were also asked to look after library and archive material. Thus, the earlier sculptors are subject to glaring omissions. However, that said, they are very much present in our minute books and annual reports, such as here in this slide, where we have mention of Julian Phelps Allen, who I mentioned earlier as the only LGBTQ+ woman in the project, as well as one or two other names that may be familiar. This records her election, Allen's election, to the Society as an associate member. She was nominated by Charles Wheeler and Alfred Hardiman. Allen is interesting as she also had no member file, even though her most famous work is the gravestone of Emmeline Pankhurst in Brompton Cemetery. The project has involved research outcomes such as publications and conference papers, as well as a series of talks entitled Reintroducing Our Pioneering Women, which involved guest speakers, the last of which was on Dora Gordine, delivered by Professor Fran Lloyd. I also organised a Pioneering Women conference with Dr. Melanie Veazey and Natalie Rudd that was held yesterday, which involved a keynote from Professor Pauline Rose, as well as 8 papers on female sculptors, both from within and outside the project. A key part of the Pioneering Women project was to connect with those that may have known these women, but be they family members, friends, or perhaps were taught by these women. A consequence of this was to increase the archival presence of these women in the Society's archive. Thus, scholarship and attention to their lives and histories and careers will increase over time, slowly rebalancing the art historical narrative. This has involved recording talks and oral histories from people that knew these women. A common thread that emerged from these conversations is how important membership of the Royal Society of Sculptors was to these women, the mark of a professional. In the Reintroducing Our Pioneering Women talks at the Society, I recorded an in-conversation event with sculptor Anne Atchison's great niece, Virginia Ironside, at the Society's headquarters. We discussed Atchison's work, and hearing her speak about Atchison was really fascinating. Having that connection with someone that actually knew Atchison, who died in 1962, was wonderful, and Virginia even told us how Atchison spoke. Such details would otherwise be lost to time. Louise Young, granddaughter of Lady Kathleen Scott and author of the biography A Great Task of Happiness, The Life of Kathleen Scott, also did a Reintroducing Our Pioneering Women talk. She brought fascinating family insights and brought along a maquette and a dress belonging to Scott. The recording of the event, as well as photographs of the objects Louisa Young brought along, have been added to the archive. Amazingly, despite being quite well known, Kathleen Scott had no membership file before this project. Another aim of the project was to promote the archive through the Society's social media, as well as in the Society's monthly newsletter, Shape and Form, with articles from the archive about the pioneering women. The Society's Twitter account has included tweets from the archive, including #ArchiveThursday tweets. I've also written many blog post articles, including a From the Archive series on the Society's blog. The project has produced content for the Society's Instagram account, and this month being Women's History Month, the Society is celebrating one of the pioneering women on its social media every day in March. So please do take a look. This project has proved not an end point and not a finished conclusion at all, but a step forward in increasing archival presence, research, and crucially attention on these women who were truly pioneers in their field, in a very male-dominated field. By generating archival content about these women, some, as I mentioned earlier, had no member file at all. It asserts that they did exist, they did have a professional career as a sculptor, and that they are important and worthy of study. Slowly, the balance of art history will tip in their favour. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent paper, Rosamund, a great introduction to the Royal Society of British Sculptors and the challenges of documenting the careers of women sculptors, particularly the beginning of the last century. So thank you very much indeed. So now we're going to move towards our final paper. So I'm going to introduce Julia Carver, who's worked at Bristol Museums and Art Gallery since 2005. Her many exhibitions and other curatorial projects include Doho Sue, New York City Apartments, Bristol, which was in 2015, and No Borders, Contemporary Art in a Globalized World, 2012. That gives you a sort of flavor of her range of her work, very broad. Most recently, Julia has curated Being Human, an exhibition of modern sculpture, which I think is, or would be, ongoing if we were allowed to get into the gallery. And that is what provides the starting point for her talk. So I'll hand over now. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to Rosamund and Louise for such fantastic presentations. I feel really honoured to be part of this session. So I'm going to share my screen now, and sorry about that. And I'll start with this slide. So in 2019, as Anne mentioned, Bristol Museum and Art Gallery opened Being Human. Curated from the collection, it was a show of mostly figurative sculpture. The so-called geometry of fear artists were the centerpiece, but I included some contemporary pieces that I hoped offered a critical dialogue with the 1950s work, especially by Reg Butler. I want to talk about Reg Butler today and some of the issues his work raises. During my research for Being Human, I became fascinated by his highly sexualized and sometimes disturbing images of women. I want to try to reflect on this ambivalence and the post-war and Cold War context of when the work was made. What makes it compelling to me? I'm interested in feminist art history, criticism, and art practice, all of which followed the period when Butler's career was at its peak. I want to use this framework to consider where Butler's work fits in today, if at all. I'll also talk about Butler's wife, Rosemary Young, Elizabeth Frink, and I'll conclude, if I have time, with some examples of contemporary work that I think shares some of Butler's sensibility. Reginald Cottrell Butler had an unusual and privileged childhood, but one with almost Dickensian echoes of the previous century. He grew up in the workhouse his parents managed in Hertfordshire, which included a maternity ward, an asylum, an old people's home, and an old people's home. In his own words, he said, middle class parents, but a kind of pseudo-aristocratic background, in as far as I was a son of the master, and around him revolved a whole community, in every single respect: birth, life difficulties, and death. This setting inspired narratives in Butler's art throughout his life, which he interpreted through a framework of Freudian psychoanalysis. Butler's first career was as an architect, and he sculpted in his free time. During the war, he was a conscientious objector, somehow avoiding jail and working as a blacksmith. The work fed into his invention as a sculptor, which he focused on full-time after the war ended. Sorry about the slide here. It's really hard to find images of this exhibition. It's the Venice Biennale of 1952. Butler was invited, along with Robert Adam, Kenneth Armitage, Lynn Chadwick, Geoffrey Clark, Bernard Meadows, Edoardo Paolozzi, and William Turnbull, to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale. This was a sculpture exhibition that launched the group onto the world stage and earned them the collective name Geometry of Fear, from Herbert Reed's catalogue introduction. Philip Hendy described Butler's ironworks as a kind of line drawing in 3 dimensions, an ability to enclose space without filling it. Flesh seemed to have been picked away from these skeletal figures, which may have been Butler's response to the death camps of the Holocaust and the sense of dread engendered by the Cold War. He spoke about how Belsen, Buchenwald, but also Nagasaki were constant preoccupations. Butler would return to flesh later. Like many of his generation, Butler was interested in Freud and anthropology. After the high modernism of the 30s, the 40s and 50s saw a renewed interest in world art. In 1948, the newly opened Institute of Contemporary Art mounted a show called 40,000 Years of Modern Art. It featured, among other ancient and world sculptures, the bulbous figure of the Venus Lepeugue. The archetypal themes of sexuality, violence, and death, evident in the work in this exhibition, were the raw material of Butler's art practice. He used the ancient and global sculptural forms to explore and express psychoanalytic theories of human behaviour. Girl, at Bristol, made in 1953, balances barefoot on a rung, clearly a posture of discomfort. By this point, Butler had moved away from the lined sculptures to shell casting, a technique he pioneered to make bronze casting a bit more affordable. John Berger described the girl as a sculpture of two halves, quote, tender and sensuous, almost to the point of sentimentality, unquote, as in the flower-like face, looking up and away, and below the naked pudendum, brutal to the point of disgust. It's precisely this kind of ambivalence that I find compelling. It encapsulates the double standard of mainstream representations of women. The adolescent appearance of Girl is obviously disturbing. In a TV show on his work, Butler announced that one of the most exciting things in the world is a girl. Even then, this was provocative, but it's hard to imagine someone saying something like this now. I think they might say young woman instead of girl, and I do think that this sculpture, although it's called Girl, is a young woman. In the context of the 50s, I do wonder if this sculpture, with her provocative undressing and her nakedness, can be seen as striving for a kind of agency that female nudes in art rarely possess. The frank depiction of the genitals, as opposed to the usual discreet and decorative triangle, acknowledges a female sexuality long denied in the Western canon. It's comparable to Lawrence in its intensity, and it sets the context to remind ourselves that the obscenity trial around Lady Chatterley was still 7 years away in 1960. I'm showing you the Willendorf Venus just as a figure of comparison, and also Nancy Sparrow's work that she made in the 80s, or well, an example of a whole body of work that she made using Sheila-Nagigs. Freud's model of the unconscious and of repressed sexual desire was common currency at this time. The theory of unconscious desires repressed during childhood as part of socialization was commonly seen as a metaphor for the conformity of post-war society. The liberation of the id, or the unconscious, was a goal of radical psychoanalysts such as R.D. Laing. Archaeology and anthropology provided the West with a conduit to repress desires through these ritual objects. The interest in these artifacts enabled European artists in the 20th century to create radically naked forms, projecting the potent sexuality they found outside of mainstream Western culture onto their work. This could be objectifying, and not only of women. Today, we would also ask questions about exoticism and appropriation. That's even before we consider, in the case of non-Western art, how such objects happen to be in our museums at all. Nevertheless, in the context of the time, the intention to liberate sexuality from the academic tradition of the nude can be seen as radical, in that it imbues the female figure with a degree of agency. She's desiring as well as desired. In Butler's last lecture at the Slave, which he called The Venus of Lepeugue and Other Naked Ladies, He was explicit about the erotic possibilities of sculpture. The lectures are revealing in all sorts of ways. It sounds like he was only speaking to men, for starters. But if we read alongside the archaic and chauvinist language, I think it's possible to trace the development of an ambitious art practice. Butler is open about how he wanted to expand his art to enable the expression of sexual desire and the doubts that besieged him. He said, "Sculpture as I've designed it is of itself an erotic experience, virtually independent of specific subject matter." He also spoke of his enduring fascination with the Willendorf Venus and the Venus of Lepugue, which he'd first encountered in Reed's show at the ICA. He passed around a copy he'd made of the Lepugue Venus for students to handle. He must have been highly conscious of the figure's function as a fertility idol. He also spoke of his recent frustration with his own female figures. Looking back at the works made in my smoke-filled workshop, lit not by daylight, but by the flames of the forge and the ultraviolet of the welder, many look preoccupied with death. Today, with death so much nearer to me personally, I would find them impossible to make. Just looking back at the metal figures, he'd begun to find these figures lifeless, and the eyes unseeing. And at the same time, he was becoming interested in the use of colour in sculpture, from Baroque polychrome wood to John D'Andrea and Dwayne Hanson. He was fascinated by the appearance of flesh in Renaissance paintings and lighted on the strange erotic substance of Cranach's women. Between 1968 and 72, Butler made 4 painted bronzes. With their exaggerated hips and stretching, spasmodic poses, they possess an aggressive sense of self. In appearance, they're distinct from the black metal figures. They're sinewy, like Cranach's Venuses and other femme fatales, with similarly smooth flesh and hostile facial expressions. Butler was keen to distinguish between eroticism and pornography. He said, "Pornography is another matter. Pornography attacks human identity. It's a destruction of individuality, an assault on the only thing we possess." Clearly, he wanted to avoid the charge of pornography. I think this is visible in Girl, but I'm not sure the painted bronzes work as erotic anyway. They're too tortured for that. I see them as a continuation of the geometry of fear. I don't think Butler ever really left his preoccupation with death behind. If psychoanalysis had opened people to the idea of the unconscious, then existentialism, with its focus on individual freedom and choices, placed the individual in a precariously balanced situation, veering between vertiginous responsibility on the one hand and impotence and nihilism on the other. This was exacerbated by the feeling of collective guilt in the wake of the atrocities of World War II, which Herbert Reed saw expressed in the geometry of fear. If by the 1980s, this all seemed well in the past, then the dread of the nuclear holocaust was still very much present. Butler made this explicit in his lecture. The 2 most powerful elements in us are related to sex and violence, or life and death. If you look around today, you'll see how great our tolerance of violence in art is. This is for the same reason, I believe, that we tolerate living surrounded by nuclear overkill. The ambition to move beyond the boundaries of cultural convention to express repressed desire is of its time, but what it frees up in Butler is closer to despair than desire. Richard Calver-Caressy has noted the similarity to Francis Bacon. You can even see the same forms of the faces funneled upwards in both artists' work, and in the noughties, Tate displayed one of the painted bronzes with Bacon's paintings. Ambivalence is evident in the work of both artists, even as they spoke about the subject with a candour still unusual at the time. Sex remained closely tied to the forbidden and to violence. Butler's drawings around the time of the painted bronzes show women tied or with their legs splayed. Later mannequins go further. Limbs and heads are screwed the wrong way onto bodies that contort disturbingly, like Hans Bellmer's dolls, which Butler claimed in his lecture to find abhorrent. Throughout his career, Butler worked with his second wife, Rosemary Young, a sculpture graduate and actually one of his students from the Slade. She assisted with all the major works. In fact, it's likely that she shell cast a girl using the technique Butler had devised. She helped him with painting the later bronzes and threaded the real hair. In another life, Young could have had a career of her own. She exhibited with Butler and the other geometry of fear artists at the ICA in 1952. They both entered the competition for the unknown political prisoner, which Butler won. Young is a key and was key to Butler. According to her, Butler believed that for a woman to become a sculptor, you had to be a very, very extraordinary person. Young's contemporary, Elizabeth Frink, was probably the kind of artist Butler meant. Frink's work was focused on virile masculinity, and she retained a fierce independence in the often macho world of sculpture. Her delight in powerful male bodies manifests an alternative expression of desire. But there's a cost to this strength, as is evident in her thuggish soldiers and her goggle heads, with her tribute heads, arguably the victims of such power. Frink's practice can be seen as a response to the violence of war, while also rejecting the emphasis of women's bodies of her male contemporaries. In 1980, she even featured in an exhibition of contemporary art focused on women's images of men at the ICA. Meanwhile, Young abandoned her own sculpture practice to support Butler's. She explained that it was almost as if, not through any fault of his own, Reg sucked it away. He drew out all your energy away from creativity into being part of the partnership. Young spoke of the great hopes her mother had had for her as a kind of Frink herself. She'd had to persuade her family to allow her to study art in the first place. Her mother's view was that it was only because Rosemary had met Reg that she'd lost out on a great career of her own. After Butler's sudden death, just a year after his Slade lecture, Young organised his retrospective at Tate, including casting new works. It was only after this dedication to her husband's career that she returned to her own work, and Girl Drying Her Foot appears in the show that's touring this year, Breaking the Mould. Young's own favourite works of Butler's were The Girl and the painted bronzes, but she acknowledged their difficulty. I mean, those painted bronzes are just amazing. When they were first done, I was quite, not dubious about it, but I was bothered about what people would say. And you know, I mean, Reg never bothered what people would say, ever. That was the thing about Reg. He moved. He was making, from the very beginning, he was on a journey. And it's the most exciting adventure. The painted bronzes bear a passing resemblance to the work of another British artist, the chair, table, and hat stand women of the pop artist Alan Jones. These fetishized women were famously castigated by Laura Mulvey in her article, "You Don't Know What's Happening, Do You, Mr. Jones?" Mulvey noted the phallic depiction of the women in Jones' portrayals, arguing that they represented male castration anxiety. Jones always claimed they were about a tough response to abstract expressionism. I don't know if he responded to Mulvey. The difference between Jones and Butler, I think, is Butler's passionate belief that his desires and his art were really closely interconnected. He said the very trade of sculpture is the manipulation of bodily substance. The spiritual, the metaphysical, call it what you like, cannot manifest itself independently. The agency of Butler's nudes makes them compelling. It implies a space for something reciprocal. If they fail, they are at least revealing about Butler's desire and ambivalence. I also think it's possible to see a continuation of this ambivalence in art from Butler's time to now, including and especially women whose art follows this darker side of masculinity and sexuality. Anna Mendieta, Jenny Holzer, Cindy Sherman, Sarah Lucas. Returning to being human, one approach in the curation to the majority of the works in the collection being by men was to include work by women that could offer commentary on these works, such as the Tribute Head by Frink that I showed earlier. But I also included contemporary work offering commentary on the body. Translated Vase by the South Korean artist Yi-Suk Young is a broken body assembled from shards of traditional ceramics to create work that has a visceral, even abject quality. Its bricolage also borrows European modernisms, borrowing from world cultures.
Julia, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm actually negligent here. It's actually just after 20 past. So if you, you could wrap up as quickly as possible, that would be great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks for the reminder. Well, finally, this isn't really a sculpture, but we were showing works on paper with the exhibition, and Zanele Maholi's self-portrait is a reference to mid-century African studio portraiture of dandyish males. But here, Zanele, the artist, has placed themselves in the role of as a gesture of non-binary visibility. And lastly, we featured a moving image piece by Mary Reed Kelly. This is Offal, a deliberate cheesy pun, in which the artist performs the role of a corpse during her autopsy, reflecting on death and images of the female body. So just to wrap up, I wanted to explore the unsettling ambiguities of Reg Butler's work, and I don't think I reached any conclusions particularly. It's still a journey. But I do think that through feminist and queer art history and art practice, we can imagine a successful erotic visual art, and it's artists like Butler who sort of helped get started along the way. Yeah, so thank you everyone for listening.
Hi, thank you very much indeed, Julia. That was another fantastic paper and wraps up our presentations. I think there is some really fascinating correspondences in the topics between the papers, and we have got a number of questions coming through because of course there's a lot of interest. I wonder whether I could use my privilege as chair just to ask. I did wonder whether there was, as it were, something that Louise would have to say to Julia about Butler's treatment of women and sort of vice versa. I mean, if nothing else, because they both use that painted bronze, which in certainly the Butler case, I mean, I personally find extremely hard to look at. Yeah. And even though they both make disturbing images, it is a very different perspective. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
Do you want to go first, Louise?
Okay, well, what I was going to say was I think what would be really fascinating to continue the conversation is with Cathie's idea that, and I think it comes through in Reg Butler's work and probably your response to his work, is this question there isn't a defined statement. It's not one thing. There is this sense of ambiguity and sort of to those figurative forms. I think that's exactly what Cathie was trying to achieve in her work, is that you're not sure quite how to respond to them. And whereas Reg Butler's was a singular, work, Cathie sort of then explodes that idea into the whole room. And when you're there, you have very mixed feelings about that are all connected with memory and, you say, sort of desire and looking and And it's a really interesting experience to sort of to go through and to really raise those questions and not to come to an answer at the end of it, but to generate that thinking. And I think that's probably quite an interesting connection to Julia's work at the moment.
Yeah, I was thinking, and when you were showing Cathie's room sort of interventions, Butler wanted to put those painted bronzes into a room, and I don't think he ever, it might be that he died before he just gave up on the idea, but Cathie's work seems to pick up from that, and perhaps more successfully as well, I don't know.
It's interesting because Cathie came to sculpture sort of through the art. She didn't train as a sculptor. She trained as a jeweler, or sort of the applied arts. And I think that sort of manipulation of materials that she felt free, slightly more freely to explore outside of the traditional, say a bit with Rosamund's talk, that sort of conventional sculptural educational history, to work outside of that has enabled her to come round to it now as from a different perspective. And I think that also feeds into her work as well. So it's being able to sort of sit outside some of these conventions to approach those historical ideas, which she really engages with. It's not that she wants to jettison all those overboard. She wants to sort of unpick them and unpack them and represent.
Great. I'd like to bring in Rosamund here. That's been a very good response to your paper as well. And something you talk very interestingly, engagingly about the sort of problems of the archive and also the research that so many of us have faced during the last year. But I wondered whether you know, sort of behind that, you had been able to make some sort of progress, and whether actually you were beginning to be able to track some of the changes in the sort of status of women as sculptors across the century, because the artists you have picked, I think, are you know, their careers span the last century. So I wondered whether you've got anywhere with that.
Yeah, I mean, the women I was looking at were practicing in the sort of early to mid 20th century. And at first, I think I mentioned that there weren't many women, especially they only were elected from 1922 onwards. There aren't many women, so you don't see them electing many other women. But as the sort of female population in the society increases, you see more women nominating other women. You see more of the women sitting on the council, for instance, as well. So their presence in the archive kind of increases and their roles increase. But in terms of, it's difficult because the archive's completely uncatalogued. So to find anything out in the archive, for instance, to look through the minute books, which are fascinating, you just have to sit down and read them for ages until you find that one little thing you're looking for, if you find it. And the earlier minute books particularly are just pages and pages of writing. It's only later in the sort of interwar period that they helpfully start putting little themes in the margin, like, I don't know, Crystal Palace Fire or Festival of Britain and things like that, so you can scan them a bit quicker. But that is a challenge, not just in terms of what you're trying to find out for research, but also in terms of when you get inquiries in and someone wants to know a very specific thing about a sculptor at a certain time, or about how the society interacted with a certain exhibition or events or gallery. You just have to sit and read and read and read. And so that is a huge challenge. But in terms of the women who did have member files, I did list what was in each of their member files. So at least then if someone inquires about them, someone doesn't have to go and physically handle that archival material again. There is now a list of what's in each file. But yeah, it's quite a big task.
Yes, it sounds like it. So there've been a couple of questions for one for you, Louise, about Cathie. Did she spend a long time in each room of the house, considering? I mean, how long did she have to plan the project, I suppose?
Well, there was the planning stage beforehand. So she would come and visit and make, site visits to the gallery. We'd correspond and send her sort of images from the collection that she could select from. Obviously, she's based in London. We were down in Chichester. So there was a number of visits and then pre-planning. And it was interesting that when we started the installation, which was about 3 weeks long, actually the rooms came together as she had conceived them to be, and it was quite interesting. They can look quite chaotic, but actually they were quite well conceived beforehand, but actually somehow they also conformed to that idea. It came together incredibly well, although some of the elements were only devised through the process. It was a bit like sculpting the rooms. She came with all her material. It was wonderful. She often calls herself a sculptural bag lady, and that she literally just turns up with all the stuff in a van, and then you start working and placing and combining, and it's a fascinating process. I was so privileged to be a part of that. And so she sort of builds on it. So they can look chaotic, but there is actually quite precise and considered judgments made for each placement of work. So yes, it was 3 weeks, quite intense, but sort of added to the whole process of the project, actually, because they sort of emerged from these realized spaces that hadn't existed before.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. There's also a question for you, Julia, from someone called John, which I'll read out. It's been recognised that all of the Venice 8 were confronted by something of a crisis in the early 60s, but it seems to have hit Butler more dramatically than any of the others. Do you think this reflects just how much they were dependent on the early 50s?
I think there were all sorts of reasons. I mean, they had huge success, and then they were kind of eclipsed by the new generation sculptors who really hated what they were doing, hated all that reference to the war, thought that it was literal and puerile, I suppose, puerile. And then the new generation were eclipsed as well. It's a bad name, really, isn't it? But I'm being facetious. I think it was really difficult for all of them, actually, because they did. I mean, Butler won public sculpture competitions, but then a lot of his work was vandalised. The maquette for the political prisoner was damaged at Tate, and it was never made anyway. And then there was one at Harlow, I think. Was it Harlow? But so he kind of withdrew a lot from making that kind of work, and that might explain the sort of obsessive nature of some of his. I'm being a bit too psychoanalytical, really, but might explain some of the obsessive nature of his focus on the female nude. But I think it was, I mean, Lynn Chadwick had a lot of success with public sculpture, but it was quite difficult for Kenneth Armitage, and Elizabeth Frink was very successful, but not. They weren't. They kind of lost their avant-garde reputations or credibility, really. And I think now we're quite lucky that we're in a moment art historically where things seem a bit less. There seems to be less sort of intergenerational competition, rivalry, in the way that during the 20th century, the isms seem to sort of compete with the parent generation, if you like. I don't know if that's really true, but it looks to me like contemporary artists look over a wider span of art to inform their own work. And also we're in a lucky position with what research like Rosamund's that opens up other avenues for people to look at. That's a really rambling answer to that question, but I've just been thinking a lot about the withdrawal from, well, of that generation. Yeah, sorry, over to you.
Yes, I think you raised a good point, which we haven't got time to get into, but about, you know, that sort of interchange between criticism, practice, and sort of art history. So those broad trends can sort of shape, and obviously they do, and yes, and certainly at that time there was this sense of these discrete moments and movements, wasn't there? I think, yeah. I think we have time for one very quick last question for you, Rosamund, from Dawn Pereira, who just, in a way, it sort of overlaps what we were talking about before, but were there any interesting women artists you discovered later in the project that you wish you could have included?
Yes. Hello, Dawn. One in particular, I'm really annoyed that I missed her. It was a lady, she's dead now, like most of them in the project, a Czech sculptor called Irina Sedleka. I hope I've said that right. And she died actually only last year. And she did the quite well-known Freddie Mercury sculpture, a bronze. So she's quite well known for that. But she was also married to the sculptor Franta Belsky, another Czech sculptor. And she's really interesting. She's had a really interesting life, really interesting career. And I wish I'd have included her as well, because I'm quite interested in sort of emigre sculptors and also emigre sculptors and the Royal Society of Sculptors, and the whole kind of the Royal Society of Sculptors used to be the Royal Society of British Sculptors, and the whole kind of, especially in the interwar period, a lot of the Royal Society of Sculptor members who were all sort of British citizens were quite worried about the influx of emigre sculptors. So she's interesting for so many reasons, and yeah, I missed her out, and it was kind of too late. I'd fixed the 25 by then, so yeah, it's a shame.
Right, well, I think we need to wind up, as it's now, we've gone over, we've been lucky to be able to go over for 5 minutes because there's a bit of a pause, but I'd like to thank you 3 speakers again for your really excellent papers, and to all the attendees for the rich sort of meta discussion in the chat and the questions, which makes it all a very sort of rich experience. So thank you everybody. A sort of couple of bits of information for anybody who sort of has missed these are that the Public Statues and Sculpture Association have a current series of talks on women sculptors, which are every Tuesday at 5:30. I think it's Tuesday. Anyway, if you go search for their site, you'll find the links to that. And I've been reminded to suggest that Dorwich House will be another place to go for everybody to go and visit. With that, I'd like to wind up and thank Flora and everybody else at Art UK who's helped support the panel, and look forward to more exciting papers later. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.